Hi, welcome to The Vitals, the Mount Sinai Health System's newest video podcast. I'm your host, Leslie Schlachter, a neurosurgery physician assistant at the Mount Sinai Hospital. Today we're talking about machine learning and the brain-computer interface, BCI. Mount Sinai Health System is a global leader in BCI and actually had the first annual BCI symposium last year here in New York. I'm happy to have Dr. Joshua Bederson, professor and chairman of the Department of Neurosurgery at the Mount Sinai Health System. He is a busy practicing skull-based and cerebrovascular neurosurgeon and global leader and innovator in the field of advanced digital technology and neurosurgery, and leading the field of BCI with his team here at the Mount Sinai Hospital. And I am the physician assistant who works alongside him. We also have Dr. Ignacio Saez, PhD and associate professor in the Department of Neuroscience, Neurosurgery, and Neurology, and the director of the Human Neurophysiology Laboratory at the Icahn School of Medicine at the Mount Sinai Hospital and the Friedman Brain Institute. His research focuses on understanding how human cognition arises from the interaction of multiple brain areas and neurotransmitter systems, particularly in decision-making behavior. We also have Dr. Amish Doshi, professor of radiology at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. He serves as vice chairman of ambulatory services in radiology, chief of the Division of Neuroradiology, and associate director of radiology residency program. He is a board-certified radiologist with a specialty certification in neuroradiology. Thank you guys for all being here. I really appreciate you guys taking the time. So I just introduced you and said a lot of things, but can we all just go quickly around the circle and kind of break it down? What do you do every day? Let's start with you, Dr. Bederson.
The most important thing I do is neurosurgery on patients with mainly brain problems. But I also am fortunate to run a wonderful department with many neurosurgeons, and I get to collaborate with wonderful scientists and physicians such as Dr. Saez and Dr. Doshi in caring for patients and advancing the field.
So you take care of sick patients in the moment, but you're also looking towards the future in research and developments.
Yep, and also in training the next generation of neurosurgeons.
What about you?
I am a scientist, and I work closely with Dr. Bederson and other collaborators in the clinical side of things. And the goal of my laboratory is to understand how the human brain works, which is a lofty goal. But if we confine that a little bit more, is how does electrical activity in different brain areas generate, how does that generate human thoughts and perceptions and feelings and emotions and actions, right? And part of it is basic neuroscience, because we want to understand how the brain works. And also there's a translational aspect of it. When it fails because there's a disease happening, how does that fail? And what can we do from a research standpoint to generate new treatments for treating patients?
So you're like more research and looking towards the future of helping people in the future.
Yeah.
Okay. Exactly. And what about you?
I'm a neuroradiologist, and I'm a radiologist, so look at pictures, but specifically of the brain and spine. We work very closely with Dr. Bederson and other specialties such as neurology and medicine to really evaluate pictures, images, MRIs, and CAT scans to see what's happening with the patient to really assist in diagnosis and treatment.
So I'm a surgical PA. I'm a neurosurgery PA. Like I said, I work with Dr. Bederson. And one of the things that I do is I get patients safely ready for surgery, whether that's to remove a tumor or a vascular malformation or something. And what we do is we get MRIs and CAT scans. We put them together and we use that in the operating room. So that's kind of like a joining of these two fields. Can you talk a little bit about how we've used advanced digital technology and images in the OR specifically?
Well, the collaboration with neuroradiology has been focused and intense for my entire career. Imaging allows us to look inside the brain before and after we've operated, to pinpoint where the pathologies are, and then to come up with the best strategies to treat them. Many times, as the physics of MRIs has advanced, the development of new sequences allow us to uncover some of the energy metabolism and chemistry of the brain in addition to its anatomy. We can really look at functional areas now and how the different brain areas are connected. And together with our neuroradiology colleagues, we can plan out the best trajectory for safe removal of a tumor. Once we're in the operating room, those images are connected to something that's akin to a GPS for the brain in something called surgical navigation. And we use the images to guide us just like we do a GPS guide driving through the streets of Manhattan, referencing our surgical instruments to the anatomy of the brain as seen on the images.
Kind of like a heads-up display, like the millennial generation would know, like Pokemon Go. Like, so you're seeing something like artificial intelligence in front of your reality.
Yeah, well, if you use Pokemon Go as an example, that really is an example of a simulation. And that's exactly what we've started to do. We take an MRI, which is or a CAT scan, which is an image or a map of the actual brain. Then we create a 3D virtual reality scenario. Think of the movie Avatar. That avatar and that scenario is brought into the operating room. It's connected to the map of the brain. And some of that information is projected on a heads-up display, just like a fighter pilot might use to look for the runway in fog. This helps us really guide right towards the pathology and to avoid really important structures, something that's rapidly evolved over the past 5 years or so.
So the use of technology is critical to be getting ready for neurosurgery and intraoperatively along with your brain. Would you agree with that?
You know, it has become almost standard of care, just like using an autopilot has become standard in the airline industry. However, one of the things that is so important is to know how to operate without those technological advances. Some people call them crutches, but sometimes those machines can fail. And what does one do if you're operating when one of those machines fails? Well, you go back to the basics of neuroanatomy and all the principles that we learn over the years of training.
One of the things that's been really helpful, I know, in the field of radiology is machine learning and artificial intelligence for scans. Years ago, when I would look at a result, it would just be, the impression and the result. Now you can see that you guys have used artificial intelligence. So can you talk a little bit about how you guys are using machine learning and AI in radiology?
Yeah, sure. For artificial intelligence, data is important. In computing data, getting the data and having an input and then an output. And radiology is prime for that because there's images with radiology. So it's a picture. It can be broken up into pixels, and the computer can be taught a variety of different things. If you look at AI kind of in the scope of radiology, it's kind of three different buckets. There's like the clinical bucket, which is where a patient interfaces with the imaging, the MRI, the CAT scan, and the AI can be used for a variety of different things. Then there's like the more operational things. Like, if you sit in an MRI, if you ever got an MRI, it could take 60 minutes to get an MRI. Right. Well, how can you use AI to make it 10 minutes? So that's, a lot of the future of AI in that space. And then the other part is that as we do more scans is that how do we use the AI to help build efficiency? So report doesn't take 2 weeks to get, it's you get it right away. Dr. Bederson gets it right away so that he can, make decisions quickly.
We're very cranky, by the way. We want it immediately.
Right. Exactly. So we gotta fit that. And so we, if you look at really like the clinical side of it, most of the AI is done is for triaging. And what that means by that is you come into the emergency room or you come into a setting where there's something acutely happening, right? We're worried about a brain bleed. We're worried about a stroke. We're worried about a fracture. So the AI, these are common things, they're important things to identify early. The AI can be used to look at the images and flag it and say, hey, you should look at me next. It's not at a point where it totally diagnoses it and says,
wait,
okay,
so the patient gets a scan, the scans are done, the images are sitting there, and AI is looking through it and kind of triaging, putting it up for the radiologist to read?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, it's exactly right. So if you have a work list, we're looking at scans, and scans are coming from a lot of different places. So if you can imagine if you had a work list of 100 scans that you were looking at, and that's your work for the day, how do you know which scan to look at first? You want to look
whichever
at
was done first, yeah. I would imagine.
You would, right. That's how we used to do it. So you just go sequentially, or someone calls you and says, hey, this patient really has an issue. But now, using the AI, the images can be sent to a server, the AI processes it and pushes it back to our system. And then it allows the work list to flag it and say, hey, look at this next. We think there might be a hemorrhage, or we might think there's a stroke. And so it gives us an opportunity to look at those images first. And then just beyond that, when you're talking about surgical planning and following up tumors and things like that. AI is really this is kind of the beginning, and a lot of innovation is happening around this where we can segment. So if you had a tumor, you would actually be able to define the tumor and then the inflammation around the tumor. And you may be able to follow that over the course of 3 years. Mm-hmm. And then we can tell a patient, we can tell the doctor that, oh, this is actually getting a little worse over 3 years, or it's getting better, or it's stable. And that can be helpful in the treatment management.
Are you guys able to, let's say, the AI is learning what normal is, right? There's normal variations. Are you guys able to, while you're reading it, tag abnormal so that the machine can learn over time abnormalities and learn from itself?
Yeah, so a lot of that work was done initially, but as AI's evolved, there are lots of different ways that engineers and people who are in the AI space can change images and create new images and train the images on that. So that's less of an issue nowadays, and we have much more of a pathway to get those AI models trained. And the FDA has cleared numerous AI related algorithms for radiology. All of this has kind of been trained and has been evaluated from a governing body to really say, okay, this is okay to be in practice. So we're less doing the clicking of what is positive and negative. A lot of the background is most of the AI companies are now coming to the radiologists, to the surgeons, and saying, what is it that you need? Sometimes the AI is telling you something you may not need.
Right.
We need to know there's a hemorrhage. We want to follow a tumor over time. So as they start to understand what we need, they're building tools for that type of thing.
So we talked about machine learning and AI, but another key phrase we hear about is BCI, brain-computer interface. So how do you transition from acute problems and using technology into the future of improvement? So what is BCI?
So brain-computer interfaces are technologies that are designed to read activity from the brain and affect some sort of change or manipulate something that is eventually handled by a computer. So a classical example of BCI is motor BCI, in which patients, for example, with spinal cord injury have an intact brain that generates the motor commands that are necessary to reach and grasp and touch something, but that information doesn't get all the way to the muscles because the way is cut, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's an injury. And so the information is still present in the brain, and if we can read it and transform it into a command that goes to the muscles, bypassing it or some sort of exoskeleton or something like that, then we can basically recuperate the function that's missing by virtue of that injury, right? So it's brain activity that's being read, and the computer is making sense of it to actually affect those changes.
How long have researchers and scientists been working on this technology?
Well, the kind of technology that Dr. Saez is talking about has been actively under research for 10 to 20 years. But I would step back a second and define brain-computer interface a little more broadly. One of the things that Dr. Doshi was talking about is how a computer connected to an AI algorithm can help us interpret an image. In surgery, that can be quite useful. Imagine you're looking at a topographical map of a national park, and you would like to pick a route through the mountains and over streams and through forests, and you want to avoid the danger points, but you need to know, what you anticipate seeing. We do the same thing during every surgery. We have to identify on each scan for each new patient pathways that safely guide us to the tumor, where the tumor is in relation to the blood vessels, the nerves, and so on. AI has now helped us identify these objects or structures, and once that is done within seconds, we can then generate a map that we bring into the operating room. So in a sense, that is a brain-computer interface, because the brain of the patient is interfacing with the computer, the AI interprets the image, and helps me interface again with the patient's brain. As we go further and further down the path of BCI, we can start to interpret more than just the anatomy of the brain, which is what I was just talking about. More recently, in the past 10 to 20 years, we've gotten better in interpreting the electrical signals of the brain. knowing how those electrical signals underlie or control motor movement, speech, sensation, seizures, a whole host of normal functions and abnormal functions. And when we talk about BCI now, one of the most important areas is interpreting the motor signals of the brain so that we can have output to computers or other structures. So it's a brain-computer interface in the sense that the brain is creating signals. There's an electrical interface with the brain. A computer's interpreting those signals, and now we're transmitting those to another computer that might be operating a Microsoft operating system or an Apple operating system to control a computer, for example. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, to me, hopefully it makes sense to everyone that was just listening. If not, they can come to the next symposium. But so really, I mean, this just on a daily, everyday basis, this is what we do. So we're really using BCI every day. But when I think of BCI, I think of somebody who had like maybe a major stroke or a major neurologic condition and doesn't have function of a limb, and they're using some sort of BCI technology to function again. So how long has that been going on, where I know here at Mount Sinai we're looking at this? How long has that been going where we're helping people with major illness?
Really was 10 to 20 years ago, and there have been patients who have been implanted for upwards of a decade, just a handful of patients. The original interfaces were very invasive, with needle electrodes implanted directly into the cortex and a platform screwed into the skull that then was attached to the surface and to a computer. Some of those patients are still going with those long-term implants. Over the past several years, though, one of the most important advancements has been in less invasive interfaces with the brain, which I think is really interesting. We've spoken and in our symposium about the two most interesting ones to me. One of them is called a stentrode, which is a set of electrodes implanted inside a stent, similar to a cardiac stent, but now this is implanted in one of the major veins of the brain, right next to the motor cortex of the leg. And those patients have been taught to move their leg instead to operate a mouse, because they're paralyzed often with something like a degenerative disease like ALS. You also mentioned stroke. Dr. Saez mentioned stroke. That's another use for brain-computer interface. Spinal cord injury, intracerebral hemorrhage. There's also BCI for speech problems in people who have had certain strokes that render them unable to speak. But this is the common use of the word BCI, motor BCI, for stroke, ALS, spinal cord injury, and speech problems.
How close are we to achieving real-time movement or speech with these technologies?
It's happening now. Patients who have been implanted with some of the speech-reproducing systems have been able to generate computerized speech by thought alone. We have patients who've been implanted with the synchron stentrode who are currently able to communicate very well with a computer, who are completely paralyzed and unable to move their extremities. So it's happening now. I will say, though, that these are all part of experimental protocols, and one of the biggest challenges going forward will be scaling this up in large-scale clinical trials.
Dr. Saez, one of the most difficult parts of having an injury or a condition like this is having autonomy and being able to take care of yourself. Are these things providing that level of privacy and autonomy, or are they still reliant on other people's helps?
Well, so far, like Dr. Bederson said, it's early stages, meaning it's still clinical trials and the autonomy is not quite there yet. It's very fundamentally a goal of these interventions to restore autonomy for these patients, for example, so they can feed themselves or write, or most importantly, communicate with others through computers and mouses and cursors and so on. It's not quite there yet, but it's fundamentally a goal. I think you mentioned privacy. that is that what you said?
Yeah.
Privacy. Yeah. So that's kind of a whole other aspect to this whole thing, because it gets into the ethical mind frame of mind reading, right? Which is is it legitimate and licit to go in there and basically listen to someone's thoughts in real time to do something useful with them, right? And this is one of those things that are going to, it's already happening and it's going to continue happening as we get better at it. And we are capable of building BCIs that are not just capable of moving a cursor, but are moving in the direction of something that's a lot more dense. Like, can you read intentions? Can you read emotions? Can you read things? And some of those might be done for translational and therapeutical purposes, right? Because if you have, for example, a psychiatric condition and your mood is affected, you want to have a way to bring that patient back to normal. Now, what happens with that information outside of the clinicians and the patients and so on is kind of a growing concern for the community of researchers and clinicians, right? Because you are actually tapping into someone's thoughts directly, right? And so there's a bit of a need for an ethical framework that is appendant to all of these to understand how to best use the technology.
And how does that relate to neuroplasticity? Like, are these things something that only work when they're in use, or can there be some sort of movement in the direction of neuroplasticity where the brain can learn from it on its own?
Question. I think for the moment, the majority of strategies and technologies that we use are not designed to leverage neuroplasticity directly, right? They're listening to brain activity and they're translating it into something that's useful in the real world. But you're absolutely right that the brain is plastic and it can change and it can adapt. And in fact, many of the disorders that we care about are acquired disorders, right? We had a healthy brain, and then, for example, think about PTSD. You have a healthy brain, and then something traumatic happens, and now you have someone who suffers from this devastating condition, right? And so that is plasticity. It's the kind of bad plasticity in a way, because
there's good and bad.
Things change, right? And if they don't change if they change in a bad direction, yes, that's bad plasticity. So you can easily conceive an application of BCI that is designed as a crutch to run the plasticity in reverse, right? And say, okay, we're in a bad state. We're going to unlearn these or run this learning process in reverse and bring the brain back to normal. That might be very well facilitated by some BCI applications, right? We have a pretty good understanding of how plasticity happens in the brain at a cellular molecular level. So it is possible that we can use a device to say, okay, you have learned this thing. It's an association between a specific context or an object or a person and a feeling which is bad. Can we actually undo that association so you can experience those things and see those places and visit those locations and not have this really bad emotional response? That could be very well done with the help of BCI technology, but really tapping into that neuroplasticity that you mentioned.
Just following up on this concept of intention and plasticity. We find that the patients who have had these BCIs have to teach themselves how to use it. The BCI gets implanted, and they don't know how to use it yet. Someone who's completely paralyzed, who has an electrode implanted near the leg area of their cortex, has to learn how to move his leg. In fact, he said, in order to move the mouse, I've got to kick my right leg out. That's how I do it. And then in order to click, I've got to stamp my foot down. Of course, neither his foot nor his hand nor the mouse are being moved by his body. But this is a form of plasticity in training himself to use a BCI. It also relates to the point that you made, that it's really his intention to move his leg, because he's not moving his leg, right? So plasticity, intention, this is all happening in real time right now with BCI. One of the things I find the most interesting is reinterpreting what we call the homunculus, or the design of the cortex, particularly over the motor and sensory areas that Dr. Saez and I have been working on with the implantation of high-density cortical surface electrodes. We're discovering, for example, that there are individual cortical signatures for each finger movement. When we stimulate the fingers and the hand, we see that individual areas of the cortex light up, if you will, differently than we've ever seen before. So this is a field that's rapidly advancing. It's very exciting to see where it's going to go. I'm very excited about what Ignacio has been talking about in reversing the bad plasticity. I feel like we're months to years away from starting to unlock some of these secrets.
You were talking about plasticity. People who have mood disorders, depression, PTSD, it's reversing a bad behavior.
Right. I mean, yes, exactly. Right. So like I said, those are acquired conditions, but fundamentally, there's not a massive biological change that underlies those. It's an experience. It's something that you've lived through that has affected those changes. Right. Some other brain disorders are kind of not like that, right? Because the brain itself is damaged. So, for example, in Parkinson's disease, there's a very well-known degeneration that happens and a part of the brain dies, right? And so that is going to be. It's much harder to imagine that we can reverse that simply with plasticity, right? That's what I meant.
What are the risks of these things? Like, can patients get hurt by, you said it's like an implantation in the brain. What can go wrong?
Sure. One of the most exciting things going on right now in the BCI world is the evolution towards less invasive types of implantations. I mentioned the stentrode before that's implanted through a needle into the vein, and that gets implanted. Fortunately, in the patients that have been implanted, there have been no major complications that I'm aware of. The other main technology we're using is the high-density cortical surface electrode. And similarly, in the 10 to 15 patients that have been done, we're not aware of any major complications attributable to that electrode. But like any brain operation, there are going to be complications. Possibility of hemorrhage, infection, stroke, it exists with any brain surgery. At the moment, we're only implanting these electrodes in patients who need surgery for another reason. And thereby, that's a much safer way of testing these. As the FDA approves longer durations of implantations, we'll be on the lookout for any possibility of complications.
I've worked with you about 10 years now, and I've seen you and other of your teammates do incredible things, and you're very capable. As these things come out to the masses, that means a lot of neurosurgeons need to learn how to do this. I mean, how long is that going to take for people to learn how to do what you're doing?
I think we have to specify the protocols and simplify them. Right now, it's a very bespoke process in which it's a very detailed experiment using all the resources of a laboratory like Dr. Saez's lab, a fairly big team of neuroscientists involved in each implantation. Over time, as with all the other treatments that have evolved, these will simplify and we'll come up with the protocols that make it more accessible. In fact, accessibility is going to be one of the really thorny issues. How do patients get access to the future BCI paradigms? Who will pay for those? These are issues that we're working now very closely with the FDA, and the FDA has been very supportive of our efforts. So I'm hoping we see progress over the next few years.
How long do you think it will take for this to be available to patients who need it, across the United States?
I would say months to years. The technical issues that we're facing right now, like Dr. Bederson was saying, require a large number of people working in the room, but that can be streamlined with a talented neurosurgeon and some assistance. I think potentially the thornier issue is what is the use for these BCIs, right? And we covered the kind of classical use, which is motor restoration of damaged motor control, and that's one particular application that's been well known and well explored, and we still have gains to make. But I think part of the pathway towards widespread application is to find new uses for this technology. And the technology itself is very flexible, right? We're trying to listen to activity from the brain and make sense of it. Like that's the fundamental of BCI, right? Brain activity in a computer that helps us interpret and helps us do something useful with it. Motor and speech control are two fundamental processes that are affected in some diseases, but there's many others that are in dire need of cures and interventions and so on, right? So I think part of the challenge to deploy these to the general public and general clinical use is to find ways in which we can effectively use the technology, right?
Well, that's what we learned at the symposium. At the end of the symposium, we had two speakers that I thought were great. It was Medicare, and the other one from the FDA. And one of the things that we learned is in order to get this, to make this available to people, for it to be FDA approved and paid for, typically there'd have to be precedent. So in this situation, there is precedent because there's been brain implants before, right? Yeah. So is it more precedent of what the procedure is or precedent of the diagnosis for the reason that we're putting it in?
It's both. And also we have to demonstrate efficacy. We had two fascinating speakers, one from the FDA, who is helping us understand the regulatory needs to make this possible to implant for longer durations of time. And the other was from the center, the CMS, the Center for Medicaid Services, Medicare and Medicaid Services. I felt like they're both on the side of the patient, really trying to help us navigate waters that will bring this technology more rapidly and very safely to the patient. And both of the issues you raised are going to be very important. What is the invasiveness and safety of the procedure? And then how efficacious is it? They spoke a lot about what is reasonable. What is reasonable for a government to pay for? Are you going to pay for someone who can barely, move a mouse around? Millions of dollars? Maybe not. But if you develop technology that allows them to fully use a computer operating system and it costs much less, then maybe that is something that can be approved. So it's a pretty complicated game that we're all working together to solve these problems.
And there's a lot of players in this. So research, development, neurosurgeons, FDA. I mean, who are all the players?
Most important player is the patient.
Yeah.
By far. That's something that I know that we all reacted to pretty strongly during our symposium. There have only been a handful of patients in the entire world who have had brain-computer interfaces implanted right now. And these are really the heroes. They're undergoing procedures that may not be as fully tested as many other medical procedures. Many times they're suffering from dire illnesses. We heard from several paralyzed patients who had had BCIs. So you mentioned those players, all of which very important. The other one to mention is industry. Two of the most important industries are at Mount Sinai. And really, this has been a partnership between academia and industry in funding the research that will drive this forward.
So we're really lucky here in New York that we have access to literally everyone. At Mount Sinai, how do we bring all of that together in order to advance this field?
It's a wonderful question. And you could see even in this room, we have 3 people from different fields working together to solve these problems. One of the issues that we faced early on was the seeming separation between industry that drives so much of the advancing technology and academic medicine. You have experts like myself in neurosurgery. You have scientists from many, many different fields. How do we get those together with industry? In the neurosurgery department, we created Sinai Biodesign. And the idea of biodesign is to co-locate engineers, surgeons, scientists, the legal framework, and the experimental framework so that we can solve our patients' medical problems by developing new technological solutions that bring value to the patients and train the next generation of entrepreneur scientists.
So it's like a on-site medical device incubator.
It is. That's almost exactly what it is. Although in addition to the incubation of new ideas, technologies, and patents and companies, we're also partnering with major industry partners such as Stryker, Leica, hopefully Medtronic, and others. These are major industry players who have technology, and we would like to provide a safe but much easier method for them to have access to clinical trials that are done under the rigor of an academic medical center. At the same time, we would like to have our surgeons get access to engineers, sometimes from industry, sometimes embedded within biodesign, so that they can bring their problems to our engineers, and we can back and forth iterate solutions that might take much longer if we didn't have everything located in biodesign.
So what's the difference between biodesign and your lab? Like, what do you guys do that's similar and what do you guys do that's different?
So we are an academic lab, right? And so we have ties with industry and we care about regulations and so on. But really our fundamental goal is the production of new scientific knowledge, new ways to understand the brain, and new therapies that we can apply to patients. Now, we're a player in the biodesign infrastructure, right? We're one of those key components together with the clinicians and the engineers and industry and so on and so forth. And so that's kind of a very fruitful interaction, which I personally found really fun because we all come at the same problem with slightly different lenses, right? And we attack it from different angles, which makes it very interactive and kind of intellectually stimulating. I see it as my job to think about the more conceptual issues, right? What is it that we're trying to do and how can we do it with the tools that we have at our disposal? If we have a problem that does not have that we don't have the right tool to attack, then maybe we can, in the context of biodesign, go to the engineers and say, hey, I really need something that does these. And so it becomes a virtuous cycle of interaction between, more conceptually driven and more implementation. Because I couldn't design a new set of electrodes, right? That's not what I do. And if I go to the engineers and they are able to design a set of electrodes that do something specific, that's amazing. It allows me to do the experiments, generate knowledge. It can also be potentially communicated to industry or leveraged as a startup. Or there's a whole ecosystem of all these different players, and we all have our roles to play. But yeah, I think my place is on the scientific and the kind of looking forward side of things.
Right.
I could give you a really cool example that came from Ignacio's lab.
I'd like to hear it.
We were all together in the operating room doing one of the first, in fact, the first ever temporary implantation of 4 high-density surface electrodes. So we had 4,000 electrodes on one of my patients' brains, spanning the motor and sensory cortex. This is the first time we've ever recorded from that many electrodes at one time in a living patient. Scientists in Ignacio's lab and a really brilliant grad student named Ali has been helping us interpret the signals that we obtained that day. And what she has done is to create a pipeline, what she calls is a pipeline. And what that is a series of analyses that take the data, the raw data that we obtained in the operating room, and process it in a way that makes it meaningful. And this is where AI ultimately will come in, because right now we have brilliant scientists who are interpreting the data and helping us understand the precise transition, for example, from the motor cortex to the sensory cortex and between the different areas of the motor cortex. This takes weeks, if not months, of detailed analysis. But she's creating a pipeline that will allow us on the next case, which could be next week for all I know, to now process in days rather than weeks or months. So you see biodesign bringing in the company that creates the electrodes, the neurosurgeon having the relationship with patients so that they have a trusting enough relationship that we can safely put these electrodes on, and the science from Dr. Ignacio's lab that allows us to interpret the results.
And from my own personal experience, I'm usually the one asking the patient, hey, can we do this? We're getting ready to do a surgery on you for X condition. We're going to be making this opening. We're going to be there anyway. Hey, would you let us do this thing so we can learn for someone else? It has nothing to do with you.
What has your experience been with patients? What has your experience been with patients who are trying to decide whether to volunteer for this?
I don't think I've ever come across a patient who, as long as you present it transparently and appropriately, and I think the way that I do it seems to work because I very rarely get a no. What I say is, hey, listen, the reason we're able to offer you the surgery that we're doing with the advanced digital technology, neuro-navigation, and with the skills he has is because hundreds of people before you agreed to let us try something. We're asking you, this is not going to help you. We've already learned what we need to help you. But in the future, whether it's a year or 10 years from now, there's information that we're going to learn from what we're about to do that's going to help hundreds of other patients. Will you let us do this? And everyone says yes. And I'm not promising anything extra. I'm just saying, like, listen, this is for the future of neurosurgery. And I don't think people don't really say no.
Yeah, it's amazing. I've had that experience many times I work with patients in the epilepsy monitoring unit, and it's the exact same thing, right? These are patients that are going through surgery. It's not the best time in their lives. They're usually, anxious about the whole procedure, as any human being would be, and they have this immediate, generous, selfless response of, I'm here because someone volunteered 10 or 20 years ago. So it is kind of my duty to do it so the next generation of patients benefits from it.
They do say, will this help me? And I'm like, absolutely not. It will not. And they're like, okay.
I wanted to touch on, kind of elaborate a little bit on something that Dr. Bederson said about the amount and quality of the data that we're getting through these neurosurgical interventions, because human neuroscience has kind of exploded over the last 10 or 20 years. And one of the reasons is because we've been recently able to measure the activity of the human brain. And in the vast majority of cases, that is done non-invasively, right? We bring a human participant, we put them in the scanner, and we take images of their brain, and we try to understand what's going on, or we do EEG, electroencephalography, and that gives you some measure of brain activity. But the difference between those non-invasive measures, the quantity and quality of data, and the quality of data that we get in Dr. Bederson's OR when we operate there is just night and day. Imagine, so I like to use this analogy, imagine the brain as an orchestra of different, cells and brain regions that are trying to do the thing, and they're kind of generating a symphony. When you're using these non-invasive techniques, it's equivalent to going to the Met Opera House and kind of sitting outside and listening to the muffled symphony, and you maybe can appreciate the tempo and the intensity, some very vague and diffuse measure of exactly what's going on. What Dr. Bederson is doing, and that experiment that he mentioned is actually kind of a world record for the number of electrodes implanted in a human brain, is he is positioning over 4,000 of these electrodes directly onto the brain of this participant, and you suddenly are seated in the middle of the orchestra, and you're listening to the nuances of the different instruments, and you can, someone who's sitting next to the brass portion versus someone who is the percussion, like you're going to start seeing all sorts of nuances, some of which are kind of impossible to anticipate. Like, we don't fully know what we're going to see because we're moving from a very limited, very diffuse picture of brain activity to this highly dense and rich and amazing activity that is also changing through time very fast, right? So imagine another analogy is, when we used to have screens that were small and the early cell phones, which had like 15 pixels or whatever, right? Like a very limited amount. And now you have your 4K TV at home. Right. You're still seeing an image. Is it the same image? Is it the same image? Well, to some extent it is, but really it isn't. I mean, the nuance, the depth, the complexity that you're going to see is completely new and improved, right? It's the same with these surgical interventions.
Do we ever see a world where all of this information that they're learning from being on the brain directly, where that then field feedbacks to you with, like, right now, like when you look at the brain, you're looking at gross anatomy, right? And there's some things that you can do with like dynamic sequences or flow movement, right? But you're not looking at electrical. But with like DTI, when you're looking at tracks, instead of having it be like a general idea of what we think that is, that can come into reality. Is that possible?
Absolutely. And I mean, a lot of work has been done in not specific electrical, but functional, right? So we typically think about imaging, and its origins are really around, structural imaging, like an anatomy, where specific parts, if you're looking at the brain, what specific parts, where they're located, how pathology affects those, how diseases affects those. So we're really just seeing at one point in time.
Right.
But for years, 10, 15, 20 years, we've had a lot of opportunity and innovation on things like functional imaging, I think that's what you were talking about, and it's able to really look at a bunch of different things. One is to look at just how the brain activity works, where blood flow is going to, and then you can ask patients to do specific tasks. You can also leverage, like, they don't do tasks, they just think of something. Theoretically, the blood flow to that area should increase. And we can leverage MRI techniques because of the advancement of
Is there like a special radio tracer you have to give?
No, there's nothing actually.
It's just blood flow.
It's blood flow. It's essentially blood flow. And what happens with that is you really are able to see the activity, relative to the other activity in the brain. So it really looks at one area that's kind of lighting up compared to the rest of the brain. And so that's how you can kind of tell if somebody's using part of their brain for a specific task or a specific thought. And then you can use all this information. With that, with the advances in MRI and with the ability to do higher resolutions and even leverage that technology, you can pinpoint even really detailed, like really to a smaller area of where you want to go. And when you get that resolution, then it helps with identifying areas really that for treatment, of course for functional things, for functional analysis. So there's been a lot of excitement around that, and the technology is definitely going to move towards being able to do that a lot more non-invasively as well.
One of the reasons that we have this podcast here at Mount Sinai Health System is we get to interview specialists in their field who have devoted their life and their career not only to patients but to the future. And I live in your world, and I am blown away by what we can do. And even here in New York City and the tri-state area, there are things that we offer that other institutions don't. I mean, I send people for scans that live in other states, and I ask them just to do one simple sequence, and they can't do that, let alone, fMRI you've been doing for a while, but even the next steps really are only offered at major institutions that can do all of this.
Yeah, and I'll just comment on that. I think it's a real tribute to people like Dr. Bederson, and our subspecialists. We have extremely highly skilled surgeons and medical professionals, and patients come for that. They come. That's where it starts with. Because of the skill that they have, the training that they put themselves. I know Dr. Bederson has gone across the world to train, and he's brought everything back to Mount Sinai, and he's trained numerous individuals under him that are extremely talented that have stayed at Mount Sinai. So I think that says a lot about the people that are here. That brings the patients, and then it's a trickle down. What happens is then we are then required, we have to then have a certain level of, refinement in how we look at things and how we deliver care. And that may be from, just purely how we deliver care in the hospital, but also on the imaging side. We have to have the best equipment. We have to make sure we have the best, all the sequences. If it's helpful for Dr. Bederson, we have to have a relationship with Dr. Bederson and his team to do the appropriate imaging sequences. That's why you might not see 5 sequences, you see 15 sequences, because that's going to give him the information that he needs. It also helps the radiologist too. As a neuroradiologist, I feel like I have learned so much from just seeing all these images, the complexity that comes through. Yeah. It makes me a better neuroradiologist. So when I see complexity, I'm less fearful of actually looking at it and figuring out what it is. And I have this open line of communication with my surgeons, with the specialist, and I can have these discussions and say, what's going on with the patient? What can we do? What is help me figure out what's going on with the patient. I can help them figure out what's going on with the patient. And I think it's as you said, ecosystem. I think that's a great word. It's this ecosystem that really drives that innovation. That really the innovation is driven because we're all trying to have the best patient care as possible.
Right. I had Dean Charney on here recently. And he was telling me, I asked him, what has made you so successful? And he said that I choose to work with people who are passionate, dedicated, and want to keep learning. And you said that, him being our leader, when I came to work with him, I had no idea what I was in for. When he sits there and he pulls his glasses down and starts thinking, I have to get my pen ready because I'm like, oh, here we go. Here comes a new project. But it's true. I never in a million, first of all, I didn't ever think I would be good at reading scans. And now I see a patient, I think it might, I'm like, oh, that might be a cavernoma. Let me get a good SWAN sequence on them. The fact that I know the difference between how GRE is related to SWAN and what everything is, in a million years, I never thought as a PA I'd be able to do that. But he expects people around him to be the best because we need to keep catching up to him because he keeps creeping along. And And he's one example of a surgeon like this at Mount Sinai. I mean, in my opinion, the best. But that's the beauty, is we all get to work in an ecosystem like this where we have people who expect that.
Meanwhile, I thought all this time patients were coming to see you.
But I'm part of what I bring to the table is part of the ecosystem too. You know, the smile and the reassurance and the detailed workup, you know, knowing how to get everything that we need to be successful. I think it's all really important, and it's incredible that we're everything that we just talked about today is absolutely incredible that that's on the docket and what we're moving forward. One of the things, like literally the reason we have this podcast is to give the real information from the experts who do this, because a lot of people find their information from Facebook chats. Are you concerned about the misinformation regarding BCI? Is there issues about that?
I'm sure there's always misinformation out there. One of the things I've heard people worry about is whether a BCI implantation can read your mind or influence your thoughts. We've heard about people who believe they've been chipped, for example, and there are implications that somehow BCI can transmit your thoughts elsewhere, can spy on your mind, or can somehow influence what you think. My experience so far has been there's nothing even remotely like that. At the moment, we don't even know what thinking is, frankly. What we see when an electrode is implanted are activation of individual electrodes, and we're trying desperately to put together what some of that information even means. We're quite focused, as you heard, on motor BCI, which is interpreting the brain signals to affect motion or to operate an operating system or to speak. Yes, there's intention, as we discussed earlier, the intention to kick a leg, translated to move a mouse, but not intention in the sense of, am I intending to steal something or do something bad or have bad thoughts? What we're really focused on is trying to help people with very dire problems. You don't put a BCI in a patient who doesn't have a very serious problem. They must either require a brain operation or have something that's devastating to them. So we're trying to help people with the gravest of conditions. Certainly, there's no implication of controlling thought or ability of even being close to that.
I feel like I think this regularly, especially in my own household. Like, use your whole brain. Like, how much of our brain do we actually use? I feel like I have a pretty big brain. How much of this am I actually using every day?
All of it.
Okay.
All of it. Maybe not all of it at the same time all the time, right? Because there's specialization. There's parts of the brain, for instance, that are active when you're looking at something. There's parts of the brain that are active when you listen to something or when you move, and so on and so forth. So at any given point in time, it might be true that you're engaging 10% of the brain areas to carry out any specific behavior. But think about it. Evolution is highly optimized. And what I mean by that is that brain tissue is very expensive energetically, right? You use about 25% of your energy just to feed your brain. And that is unusual because other animals don't use that much energy to feed their brains, right? So we have to really have a really strong evolutionary advantage to keep this very expensive piece of tissue around. And, you know, we don't have that problem anymore, but evolutionarily, your problem that you face on a day-to-day basis is getting enough energy to make it to the next day and survive. Right. And if a lot of energy is consumed by your brain, you better have a good reason to have a brain in the first place. So we do have a lot of good reasons to have brains. The way I think about it, one fundamental reason to have a brain is to generate behavior that helps you survive, pass on your genes, and so on and so forth, right? If a piece of brain is redundant or is not doing anything, it will be lost in evolution. Every single piece of your brain has a specific function. Do we understand what every piece of the brain is doing at a given point in time? Maybe not yet, but there's really very likely a very good reason why everything is in.
So as a surgical PA, neurosurgery PA, we often use the term eloquent and non-eloquent brain, yes. Right? So if a patient comes in and has a big tumor, let's say, you know, a right frontal tumor compressing or involving a lot of brain, we're probably a little bit less worried about that than something occipital. And that's because maybe this is more eloquent. So can you describe the difference between eloquent and not eloquent?
Absolutely. I think all of cortex is useful, but some of it is more visibly useful than other parts, right? So for instance, I know when Dr. Bederson does tumor resection surgeries, and you help him do those, he has to be very careful to not resect parts of the brain that, for instance, control the movement of your hand, right? You resect it out, and then suddenly the patient can move their hand. And so that is a very grave deficit that you've induced through the surgery, right? So that's what would be traditionally called eloquent cortex. And eloquent just means in this context, we know exactly what this piece of brain is doing. Right. And if you remove it, you're going to cause a deficit. So it's very easy to understand eloquent cortex for pieces of the brain that have very clearly sensory or motor functions, right? If I take this piece of brain out, you can't move your hand. Yeah. If I take this piece of brain out, you can't understand language. If I take this piece of brain out, you can't hear anymore. Right. Those are very obvious deficits, right? That we constantly test our patients for in the context of tumor resections. But going back to my earlier point, I think it's unlikely that there's any part of the brain that doesn't do anything, right? But it might not be that visible. And so, for example, historically, the prefrontal cortex, which is the frontal part of your brain, which is really developed in humans when compared to monkeys and even rodents and other mammals, that's been kind of a mysterious part of the brain because it's unclear what it does. We don't really know. You can have a lesion in the prefrontal cortex and it might not be immediately obvious what's happening to you. Right. But as we learn more and advance our understanding, you start realizing, oh, this patient actually is different.
Oh, they are acting different.
They're acting different. and you're very close to the patients. You notice that very, very, very clearly.
I sometimes feel like I don't meet my patients until months after surgery because you're meeting a totally different person.
Right. Yeah. So how would you describe that? Because, when you're very careful with this eloquent cortex versus this non-eloquent cortex, sometimes you can change something that is not that obvious and it's subtle, but you pick up on it when you talk to them.
The two biggest ones are frontal and cerebellar, right? So there are surgeries that we do where we know there's either a lot of compression of the frontal lobe or cerebellum, and to avoid postoperative swelling, we'll remove some of the frontal lobe or some of the cerebellum. For the cerebellar patients, I tell them you'll probably be fine. You're going to have some balance and coordination issues after surgery. It might linger a little bit longer if we have to remove a little bit more for approach. For frontal lobe, I don't really ever see that much of a change if we have to remove a little bit for an approach. But for someone who had significant compression before surgery, and then we do a decompression, I have patients who, I actually shared a story here recently. I've had patients who are depressed, angry. They gain a lot of weight. They won't go to the gym. I had a lawyer who was getting fired from his job. And next thing you know, we find this big tumor, all the swelling comes down afterwards, and this happy, motivated person. So it leads to this frontal lability, these emotional and decision-making changes that I swear these patients are completely different people 3 to 4 months after surgery than when we first started. Yeah, it's amazing.
I was going to say also, if you look at just stroke, right? Things like, when we look at stroke and a patient comes to the emergency room with the stroke, it's much easier to say this is a patient with a stroke if they have a very specific deficit. They have an issue with moving their arm, they can't speak. And then you're really concerned that, okay, there's a stroke, because we can localize where that is as to what you were saying. And, versus the inability to walk or tripping or something, or a personality change, the same pathology, same thing can be happening in the brain, a stroke or tumor or mass, as you were saying, but it's not as clear. Yeah. So that's where the imaging obviously helps very significantly in really identifying what the underlying cause is. And you can imagine, as you're treating these people, if you have a very clear deficit, then you're triggered to say, okay, this is what I want to do. I want to do the imaging. I have a good idea of what's going on. If it's the other thing, it's the non-eloquent and personality change, it's very difficult to know what the next steps are.
Yeah, families were like, "Oh, we just thought Granny was becoming mean,"
Yeah.
And it may, and sometimes it's the case, but it might not be. So we talked about eloquent, non-eloquent, but even eloquent, there's more of a breakdown. So eloquent can mean vision, hearing, seeing, moving. So, what is the difference between those tissues? The tissues that give you vision versus speech?
Well, at a cellular level, not much, really. The brain is highly modular. Cortex is actually, you can think of a little motif about a centimeter a half a millimeter square in diameter column that is repeated throughout the brain. So you have a lot of copies of the same thing. And then the trick is how they're connected, meaning what kind of information flows into a region of the brain and where is it sent to, right? So for example, sensory parts of the brain, your occipital cortex, which is in the back of your head and is the part of the brain that processes vision, receives input from the retina. So light comes in through your eyes, hits the retina, it's sent there, and so it receives that type of information. And it processes it, and it is very highly eloquent because we know that's the kind of information that it's doing. I like to think of it this way. Things that are very close to the external world are much easier to study in the brain. And nothing is easy, but easier, right? What do I mean by that? If you put someone in a scanner and you present a bunch of tones and you give them auditory stimulation, their auditory cortex is going to light up. And you're going to go like, ooh, eloquent cortex that is processing auditory information. You can do the same thing with a visual stimulus and so on and so forth, because it's kind of the first stop in the brain that processes this information. And it's easy to elicit that response because you have pretty good experimental control over how to do this. That's going in. Going out of the brain, you have motor control. And it's kind of similar in the sense that I can ask a patient to move, make a fist, punch, or grasp something, and the motor cortex will light up, right? So those are the parts of the brain that are closer to what's out in the external world. And that makes them easy to study because we have control over the external world. Now, we think a lot about sensory motor transformations, meaning, okay, you see something mysterious happens, and then you do something. And it's the in-between part where the non-eloquent cortex is and the mysterious stuff happens, right? Because it is relatively easy to imagine that you have a part of the brain that lights up when you hear a symphony, and it is easy to imagine there's a part of the brain that lights up when you're playing a piano. But what happens in between? How does your memory come into play? How does everything that you've learned, how does your emotional reaction to the music come into play? How does the context in which you're doing that come into play? And that is potentially the non-eloquent cortex that we were talking about, right? Which are minute but important cognitive functions that are not so obvious, right? So imagine you do all those, but you're not feeling anything. That's not a healthy brain, but it's not as easy to tap into or study as it is if you're just not capable of, playing the piano, and you were before, right? But all those functions are kind of intermeshed in that, cortical dark matter.
Interesting. Like I do a lot of a new patient intake, and where I'll see patients that come in, they get let's say Joe Smith has a headache, he gets a scan, the scan finds some abnormality, they come in, I see them, evaluate them, and I'm just blown away. There are conditions called like arachnoid cyst or Dandy Walker. There are conditions where there's like not much brain tissue at all, but yet the person is fine. Never knew they've gone their whole life with like half of their brain tissue. So I guess it's not quantity, it's quality.
Yeah, it's amazing, right? And we were talking about plasticity earlier and how the brain adapts after injury, and how you can, there's reports, for example, of people who lose their sight because they have an accident and they don't get visual input anymore. That part of the brain that used to process visual input is now repurposed to do something else.
Right.
And they, and of course, there's kind of anecdotal and more solid evidence that these people become much more sensitive to other sorts of sensory stimuli, right? There's a compensation that happens. Part of it is because you have a piece of brain that used to be very busy processing all this visual stimuli, and now it's not receiving any of those inputs. So the brain is like, okay, waste not, do something, right? Let's use this for something else.
Yeah. It's incredible.
And that's really amazing.
It's also incredible what we still don't know.
Yeah. We don't know a lot of things.
I'll just add, because it was interesting what you were saying about, sometimes you see patients and they have something in the brain and they're totally fine.
I mean, or they have nothing. Or there's like a whole space of nothing.
They have nothing. And obviously they're coming to see you for some reason. And so you're looking at the brain. And it goes back to we don't always image, right? Like people are not walking around. And nowadays, people are getting whole body MRIs and screening and things like that. And it's important to remember this aspect of it's not just the picture, it's the patient, right? So we always say that don't treat the picture, treat the patient. And I think that's an important thing because as we look in, you can have things in the brain. You can have things that are not normal in the brain, but
it doesn't mean they're bad.
Exactly.
Right.
Because if you're functioning and things are going well, and there might be things that are not going well, but that are not attributable to that particular thing.
I want you guys to each take a turn, and I'm going to give you your opening line, and then you're going to complete it. You're going to say 3 things I would never do as a neurosurgeon. 3 things I would never do as a neuroradiologist. So I want you guys to think about 3 things that you would never do, or 3 things that are the most important to me as a neurosurgeon. You have to make it a little bit fun, a little bit kitschy. If you don't like that, then you can tell a really incredible, kind of heartwarming story about something that you did amazing.
3 things I would never do as a neurosurgeon, and this is not meant to be profound. I would never not attempt something new. You know, thinking big and getting big things done is just as easy as getting small things done. It takes the same amount of energy to create a new program as it does to change the way our scissors are sharpened in the basement of our operating rooms. So thinking big, attempting new things, I would never not do that. Number 2, even though I used to do it as a kid, I would never ride a motorcycle without a helmet.
But I have seen you almost get on a bike, an actual bike, without a helmet.
So things I would never do as a neurosurgeon, you know, I would not necessarily sometimes be as reckless as I am if I were in control all the time. And the third thing is I would never prioritize ideas, performance, accomplishment over the relationships that I have with other people. Because as you heard today, it's this ecosystem allowing people's talents to rise to the top that make it work so well here.
I love that.
Not meant to be profound.
No, I liked it. What about you?
3 things I would never do as a scientist. That's a tough one because there's so many things that we can be doing wrong every day. I think that I'm going to have to go with don't lose sight of the goal, right? It's very easy to get sidetracked by intermediate goals, like, you know, getting the next paper, getting the next grant, and so on and so forth, and kind of forget. And I've had that feeling a couple of times in my career where I'm like, I'm doing something and I'm thinking, is this really going to help our patients? And if the answer is no, then you have to pivot and you have to change and you have to correct course, right? And it's kind of easy to get distracted by these intermediate goals. So not do that. The second is not be isolated, right? We've talked about the ecosystem and the synergies that come with talking to others from other disciplines, even within science, within other people who have other models of disease and that work on different problems and so on. That always makes for engaging conversation. You never know when the idea is going to strike you and it's going to come out of left field and inspire you to do something else that you hadn't thought about when you're talking to someone who does something completely different. And the third one would be, I don't know, actually.
You don't have to have 3. It's okay to have 2.
It's okay to have 2? Yeah. There's so many that I could put in number 3, but I'm just going to leave it at that.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
All right. 3 things I would never do as a neuroradiologist. Guess I wouldn't call myself a body radiologist. I think the other thing is I would never stop asking questions. I think for radiologists in particular, it's important. We're looking at images, and I think it's very important that people don't fall into a vacuum of just looking at pictures. I think that it's like when you go see art in a museum, context is so key. You don't, if you look at just art and there's some value to it and, you're looking at it in a way that you're interpreting, but when you're given context, you look at things very differently.
Yeah. Why was a scan ordered?
Yeah. Why was a
How old
scan
is this
ordered?
person?
I look into the history and I see, maybe a course of treatment that's been done or something. And we've had this conversation, where you've sent me things and I've looked back and I've looked at what medications there's on. Mm-hmm. And you tie those things in with the with what's happening with the patient, and you can maybe see what's going on with the imaging. And then the other thing I would just say is it's kind of a general thing. Is the third thing would be to not have empathy. And I think for radiologists in a reading room, it's often the idea of, again, being in a bit of a vacuum, but it's really, you're there for the patient, and it's really trying to understand what they're going through. And we see it a lot, in radiology, we're sometimes the first person to see the pathology. And you might have a child, you might have, somebody who fell off a ladder, or just someone coming in that's older that for the first time they had a seizure, and you're catching for the first time that they have some pathology in the brain. Right. And, I think it's this kind of, we're, again, in a vacuum looking at pictures, but there's a person behind those pictures. And everything that you say and all the things you describe are going to affect the next sequence of events for them.
Right. Okay. Well, I want to thank you guys for being here today. I really enjoyed having you. I learned something, which is great. I think we talked the tip of the iceberg here. So I think we definitely need to come back when there's more patients and talk more about the future. But thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.